Okay, kinesiology 230. This is chapter 22. We're now moving into presentation 2, and this is a presentation on multiple sclerosis. This is on page 602. And I'll say this again, just real quick before I jump into the next slide. We're going to go over some of the basics here. We're not going to do a super deep dive. I'm working under the presumption that if you work with any of these conditions, these very specialized conditions, you're probably going to specialize in that area, and you'll end up earning additional certifications or credentials to support your work in this area. So this is not going to be exhaustive, but again, I can't stress this enough. You're talking about a very specialized population that requires some specialized training to work with these individuals. This is going to be kind of a topical overview. So with MS, it's a disease that disrupts communication between the central nervous system and other parts of the body. As it progresses, the body attacks the myelinated sheath surrounding the axons, which we've talked about early on in this class, and also damage nerve cells in the gray matter of the brain. So the results of this are a formation of scar tissue, and scar tissue is, that's where the term sclerosis comes in. That's scar tissue, or plaques in the white matter. And MS is an autoimmune disease, very much like a rheumatoid arthritis, where it attacks the healthy cells. MS attacks healthy cells. And the severity and symptoms can depend upon the location, the severity of the sclerosis, where, like I mentioned, in the central nervous system, and how far along the person is in the process. So the big thing that they have here in the book is these three main phases: exacerbation, remission, and relapse. And exacerbation is the onset of symptoms, right? Sometimes referred to as an attack. Remission refers to the termination of symptoms, and relapse refers to the return of symptoms. With these three, it's not like your person goes into remission and never comes out, or they have a relapse and they never ever come back and you'll never see them again. It's a constant ebb and flow, and you have to understand when you work with clients with MS, you have this kind of understanding that they're going to have good days, they're going to have bad days, and they're going to have really awful days. And as a result, when you work with people, you have to just be accommodating, because they might reach out to you that day and say, this is not the day, I can't do it. And usually they do take some type of medication to bed down some of the symptoms, whether it's a type of corticosteroid, or they know here beta interferon, to help reduce the severity of an exacerbation or slow the progression of a disease. I'll still say this, having done some work with this population, I've had a couple clients who had MS. There's good days, there's bad days, and there are completely awful days, just so you're aware. They talk about the different stages. They talk about, common symptoms that are early on and then later on with the disease. And I can remember one individual who talked about how he had very stiff muscles. He'd get up and go try to walk, and he felt like stiff. He had to stretch out before he walked, and come to find that he had MS. And those were some of his early stages. So you kind of look at these things that are maybe benign, and you feel like you're just getting older and you're getting maybe awkward or clumsy or whatever it may be. But in actuality, it could be some early symptoms. Later on, you see some other things like you see listed down here. When you get into this, they have these different classifications: relapsing, primary, and secondary. And these are things maybe you want to take a read through, but you're not going to be quizzed on later on in this class. But if you're going to get into this field and maybe perhaps work with this population, this might be a good starting off point. And then also on that previous slide, a good starting off point for you might be like National Institute of Health, National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, where you can find more information. All right, I talk about heat could exacerbate the symptoms of MS. So I find a comfortable environment, perhaps not working out in the sun, perhaps not working out in the freezing cold, but you try to find a controlled environment to work out with your client. With exercise testing, the challenge you have with exercise testing is that clinical exercise testing is obviously done under a controlled environment, and usually you can do exercise testing as a practitioner, but they state that that a person who has MS should probably do so under the supervision of a physician to rule out ischemia and coronary heart disease before starting an exercise program. which I agree with. Proper medical clearance, I agree with. Personal trainer can safely administer submaximal aerobic exercise tests, which I agree with. But I will also agree with this because of incoordination and possible balance deficits. Perhaps leg or arm ergometry should be the two main modes of testing. And I agree with those, even to a certain degree where recumbent will be better than upright, as we'll talk about later on. And that comes from the simple fact that your clients who have MS will have limitations in terms of their balance, in terms of their coordination, and as a result, you can put them in a less risky environment if you use upper body or lower body ergometry, as opposed to walking on a treadmill. When we look further down in this passage, they talk about just some general items and bullet points when addressing resistance training. They talk about the balance that you have to have between flexibility and mobility. You want to have those, but also muscle tone. With people who have MS, they have the spasticity, if you will, in the muscles because of the myelinated sheath is being eroded. And if you're able to work with a client, help them work through particular ranges of motion, when you contract, say like your bicep, the tricep has to relax. There's no contractile signal that goes to the tricep at that point. But when you contract the bicep and close the elbow joint, the tricep has to lengthen. So you have a stretching effect that has to happen when you contract one muscle that's an antagonistic muscle to another. So strength training has its place in being able to foster mobility and flexibility and range of motion at particular joints. Now, they recommend here that mobility and range of motion at joints in the upper and lower extremities should be tested with a goniometer, which I'll agree with, which is fine. You can use a goniometer with anybody. But what they really want you to focus on is spastic muscles and contractures. And if you think back to like elasticity and plasticity, elasticity was short-term flexibility gains, where plasticity was more permanent P, plasticity. That's how we remembered it. So when you read this little passage here, before prescribing resistance training, the personal trainer should assess the health history of the individual and assess any potential limb weaknesses, spastic muscles, and contractures, which is or are permanent shortening of muscles and tendons. So just think of this in terms of contractures being the permanent shortening, where you had plasticity was the permanent lengthening or elongating of muscles. So this would be the exact opposite. So to a certain degree, again, you're fighting the battle against erosion. And as a result, part of this battle is the flexibility side. And, you'll have clients who will have contractures and they have this permanent shortening. I would take a moment just to kind of read through that a couple times before you move on, because I know you're going to see that later. When we talk about aerobic conditioning, depending upon where the person is in their process, depending how severe the case, how long they've had the sclerosis itself, the damage that they've had, a person can do cardiovascular activities, but there are some limitations. We talked about balance and coordination, stability. You have to take those into consideration. So as a result, some people might be limited in their ability to walk at speed or even be able to stand up. You might have to use a ergometer of some variety, whether it's an upper body ergometer or a bike. And again, it might even be better to use a recumbent bike as opposed to upright bike. So what they talk about here is light to moderate workload that progresses to higher intensities. The goal is for persons with MS to improve cardiorespiratory function and reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease. And so they talk about this in particular. It's recommended that deconditioned people with MS begin exercising at 2 days per week at 40% heart rate reserve, which to that end, one would look at that and say that's pretty darn low, but you also have this kind of extra load that's placed on the body in terms of working on balance and stability. And also when you have the contractures that we talked about before, because of the contracting muscle, you end up having a BMR requirement that's a little bit different because they're burning more calories than they would be if they didn't have some of these conditions, or didn't have MS, excuse me. Some precautions and guidelines for exercise testing and training of clients with MS. Here's a list of these, and I'll let you kind of read through them. With this, it's by no means exhaustive, but this is kind of this is or are the main ones that the book goes into. And I think you just need to be aware of some of the main ones, like in terms of good days, bad days. The energy cost of walking can be 2 to 3 times higher than normal people for MS. So you have to adjust workloads. They're thermosensitive. Maybe you have to actually strap the person, their foot to a pedal on a bike. Recumbent might be preferred over upright for clients with balance problems. Imbalances between agonist and antagonist muscles are very common, and this is very true when you start talking about contractures. If we go into the remainder of the list, the variable nature, you're going to have good days, bad days, right? And you may have to make adjustments on a daily basis. And on awful days, they might not come in. Monitor heart rate before, during, and after. Regular follow-ups. In case of exacerbation, exercise should be discontinued until complete remission. Some clients will want to work through that phase. For others, it's too much. They can't. But if they do come in and they're noting that they're kind of in an uptick or an exacerbation stage, you may have to refer them to their physician and obtain medical clearance before you can work with them again. But you're doing right by the client if you do that. And what you end up having is some adaptations that you have to make in terms of upper body ergometer. So program design guidelines for clients with MS. With this, just kind of take a moment and reflect on some of these. You have machine and free weights, body weight, resistance bands. So here you have strength, here you have more cardiovascular, and here you have flexibility. And they're saying 2 days a week for strength, 2 to 5 days a week for cardiovascular, 5 to 7, a couple times a day for flexibility, which you think about some of the stuff we talked about, contractures and the spastic nature of muscles. With MS, that makes sense. Training loads, and then you get into here, what's the overall volume. So maybe take a moment just to read through those. If you want to look further, you could probably do some research on this. So I'll say it again. This population is a very highly specialized population. And if you're going to train people from this population, I would urge you to go out and source more information, because it can be highly complex, and you'll have to have well-informed conversations with your clients regarding their condition. And I will tell you this, there's going to be no one more highly specialized in the condition of MS than a person who has MS. And to a certain degree, you can learn a ton from that person, but you best do yourself a favor and go out and try to learn as much as possible regarding a condition if you're going to work with that population. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and sign off from this presentation. On to the next one.